Welcome to Chosen by Love, where fate brings hearts together in the most unexpected ways. Subscribe and join our growing family of story lovers. Tell us where you're watching from, and let's begin today's journey. The strangest part wasn't that Alara Bennett got married at 24, it was that her husband never opened his eyes. The rain tapped softly against the stained glass windows of St. Andrew's Chapel as Alara stood frozen at the altar, her fingers trembling around a bouquet she had never wanted to carry. Rows of polished wooden pews stretched behind her, occupied by strangers, lawyers, and a handful of executives dressed in dark suits. No friends. No smiling relatives. No groom waiting beside her. Just silence. The minister cleared his throat and glanced toward the back of the chapel where a large video screen displayed a live feed from a private hospital room, less than 2 miles away. On that screen lay Callum Whitmore, billionaire founder of Whitmore Biotech, motionless beneath crisp white sheets. His chest rose and fell with mechanical steadiness. His eyes remained closed. He had been in a coma for 14 months. Alara swallowed hard. This couldn't be real. Yet the contract sitting inside her father's briefcase said otherwise. 3 weeks earlier, she had learned the truth about her family's finances. Her father had buried them beneath years of debt, bad investments, and promises he could never keep. Then a solution appeared. A legal arrangement offered by the Whitmore Family Trust. Mary Callum Whitmore remained legally tied to him for 1 year, and every debt would disappear. Her father called it salvation. Alara called it a cage. But standing there now, hearing the minister recite vows to a man who could not answer, she realized she had already lost the argument. "Do you accept this marriage?" the minister asked gently. The question echoed through the chapel. Alara closed her eyes for a second. Somewhere deep inside, a voice begged her to run. Instead, she heard her father shift impatiently in the front row. She opened her eyes and whispered, "I do." The ceremony ended less than 10 minutes later. No music followed. No applause came. The guests quietly filed out. Papers were signed. Hands were shaken. Business was completed. By evening, Alara found herself standing outside Whitmore Memorial Hospital, staring up at 27 floors of glass and steel glowing against the stormy sky. A private elevator carried her to the restricted medical suite, reserved for the city's most famous patient. The doors opened onto a hallway so quiet it felt detached from the rest of the world. A nurse greeted her politely before leading her toward a pair of tall oak doors. "He's inside," she said softly. Then she left. Alara stood alone. For several seconds she simply stared at the door. Husband. The word felt foreign. Unreal. Finally she pushed it open. The room looked more like a luxury apartment than a hospital suite. Warm lighting softened the corners. Expensive artwork decorated the walls. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline. Yet all her attention drifted toward the man lying still in the center of the room. Callum Whitmore looked nothing like the ruthless billionaire magazines loved to describe. Without the headlines and tailored suits, he looked surprisingly human. Young, quiet, fragile. Alara slowly approached the bedside chair and sat down. Neither of them spoke. One because he couldn't. The other because she didn't know what to say. Minutes passed. Rain streaked the windows. The heart monitor hummed steadily beside him. Eventually she let out a nervous breath and folded her hands in her lap. "I don't know if you can hear me," she said softly. "Honestly, I'm not even sure why I'm talking." Her voice sounded small inside the enormous room. She glanced at his face again. "But I guess we're married now." A sad smile appeared briefly before fading. "For whatever that's worth." The monitor continued its steady rhythm. Alara lowered her eyes. "I didn't want this any more than you did." Then something happened, so small that most people would have missed it. A faint movement, barely visible. One finger twitched against the sheet. Alara's breath caught. She stared at his hand. The room suddenly felt very still. Outside, thunder rolled across the city. Inside, for the first time in 14 months, Callum Whitmore moved. Alara did not sleep that night. Long after the nurses changed shifts and the city lights blurred beyond the rain-streaked windows, she remained in the chair beside Callum's bed, replaying the tiny movement she had seen. She told herself it could have been nothing. A reflex. Coincidence. Wishful thinking. Yet every time she closed her eyes, she saw that finger move again. By morning, the storm had passed. Pale sunlight spilled across the private suite, painting long golden rectangles across the hardwood floor. A young nurse entered carrying a tablet and a cup of coffee. "You are here early," Alara said. The nurse smiled. "Actually, you are here late." Alara glanced at the clock and realized she had never left. Embarrassed, she stood and stretched. Did the doctors see any changes overnight? The nurse hesitated. "Nothing significant. His condition remains stable." Stable. The word felt strangely disappointing. After the nurse left, Alara walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. 27 stories below, the city was already awake. Cars flowed through downtown streets. People hurried toward offices and coffee shops. Entire lives moved forward while Callum remained trapped in silence. She looked back at him. "You are missing all of it," she whispered. There was no response. Yet for some reason, she found herself returning to the chair. The following day she came back again. Then again the day after that. At first, she told herself she was simply honoring the contract. She was his wife, at least on paper. It felt wrong to disappear. But as the days passed, something changed. The room no longer felt intimidating. The silence no longer felt empty. One afternoon she noticed a small bookshelf tucked beside a fireplace she had somehow overlooked. Most of the shelves contained business books and biographies. But near the bottom sat a worn copy of The Secret Garden. The edges of the cover were faded from use. Curious, she picked it up and opened the first page. A handwritten note appeared inside. To Callum. "For the days you forget to be happy. Love, Mom." Alara stared at the words for several seconds. Somehow they made the billionaire feel less like a headline and more like a person. She carried the book back to her chair. "I guess someone wanted you to read this," she said softly. Then she opened the first chapter. At first, her voice felt awkward. She was reading to someone who might never hear her. Yet as the minutes passed, she relaxed. The story flowed naturally. The room filled with the sound of her voice. Outside, afternoon sunlight warmed the glass. Inside, the steady rhythm of the heart monitor continued. Then something unusual happened. A nurse passing through the room glanced toward the monitor and paused. She stepped closer. "That is strange," she murmured. Alara looked up. "What?" The nurse pointed toward the screen. Callum's heart rate had risen slightly. Not dangerous. Just enough to be noticeable. "Does that happen often?" Alara asked. The nurse studied the reading. "Not usually." She looked at the open book in Alara's hands. "What were you doing?" "Reading." The nurse smiled politely. "Maybe he likes the story." The comment sounded lighthearted. But after she left, Alara found herself staring at the monitor. She looked down at the page and continued reading. A few minutes later, the numbers shifted again. Small. Subtle. Real. Her pulse quickened. "Can you actually hear me?" she asked quietly. The room remained still. Yet for the first time, she was not entirely sure she was alone in the conversation. From that day forward, reading became part of her routine. Every afternoon she arrived with coffee, opened The Secret Garden, and read a few chapters aloud. Sometimes she talked about her own life instead. The apartment she had lost. The dreams she once had. The fears she never admitted to anyone. And every time she spoke, the monitors seemed to respond. Tiny changes. Tiny signals. Tiny reasons to hope. What Alara did not know was that several floors below, a member of the Whitmore family had already noticed the reports appearing in Callum's medical file. And they were not happy about it. For nearly 2 weeks, Alara followed the same routine. Every afternoon she arrived at the private suite carrying a coffee she rarely finished, and the worn copy of The Secret Garden tucked beneath her arm. The nurses began greeting her by name. The security staff stopped checking her identification. Even the silence inside the room felt familiar now. Yet the small changes surrounding Callum were becoming impossible to ignore. His heart rate responded to her voice. His brain activity showed subtle increases during her visits. Twice, nurses documented slight movement in his hand. None of it was enough to predict recovery, but it was enough to create whispers throughout the hospital. One cloudy Thursday afternoon, Alara finished reading a chapter and closed the book gently. She looked toward Callum. "You know, I never liked fairy tales," she admitted. They always seemed too convenient. Good people suffered for years and somehow everything worked out in the end. She smiled sadly. Real life does not usually work that way. The heart monitor emitted its steady rhythm. Maybe that is why I keep coming back. I guess I want proof that impossible things can still happen. She was about to continue when voices drifted through the partially open doorway. At first she ignored them. Hospital staff passed by all day. But then she heard Callum's name. Instinctively she looked toward the hall. A woman stood outside speaking quietly with a man in an expensive gray suit. The woman appeared to be in her late 50s, elegant and perfectly composed. Elara recognized her immediately from photographs. Vivian Whitmore, Callum's stepmother. Beside her stood a younger man with dark hair and a sharp jawline. Owen Whitmore, Callum's cousin and the acting chief executive officer of Whitmore Biotech during Callum's absence. Neither realized the door was slightly open. The reports are becoming a problem, Owen said quietly. Vivian folded her arms. The doctors still say recovery is unlikely. Unlikely is not impossible. His voice tightened. The board is asking questions. Elara remained perfectly still. Then reassure them, Vivian replied. That is your job. Owen glanced toward the room. And what about her? A pause followed. The wife? Vivian asked. Yes. Elara's stomach tightened. She should not be influencing anything, Owen said. The staff keep mentioning her. The nurses talk about improvements every week. Vivian's expression hardened. A few hopeful nurses do not change reality. Maybe not, Owen replied. But if Callum wakes up, everything changes. Silence settled between them. Then Vivian spoke again, her voice lower than before. He has been gone for 14 months. The company is stable. Investors are satisfied. We cannot allow false hope to create unnecessary complications. We cannot allow false hope. The words echoed inside Elara's mind. Neither person sounded relieved by Callum's progress. If anything, they sounded worried. Moments later they walked away. Elara remained frozen in her chair long after their footsteps disappeared. Something felt wrong. Deeply wrong. That evening, curiosity pushed her toward the nurse's station. She asked harmless questions. How often did family members visit? Which relatives attended medical meetings? The answers surprised her. Vivian rarely came upstairs. Owen almost never entered the room. Most decisions were handled through lawyers and administrators. It felt strange for people supposedly devoted to Callum's recovery. The following afternoon, Elara arrived earlier than usual. As she stepped from the elevator, she noticed a folder resting unattended on a nearby counter. Across the front were printed words, Whitmore Medical Review. She had no intention of snooping. Yet before she could stop herself, her eyes landed on a highlighted sentence visible through the partially opened cover. Patient demonstrates measurable neurological response during repeated vocal interaction sessions. Elara felt a chill run through her. Someone had documented everything. The responses were real. The improvements were real. And suddenly she understood why certain people seemed so uncomfortable. She slowly looked toward Callum's room at the end of the hallway. For the first time, she wondered whether his coma was not the only secret hiding inside the Whitmore family. The questions followed Elara everywhere after that. They lingered in the elevator rides, echoed through the quiet hallways, and waited for her each time she stepped into Callum's room. Why did certain members of his family seem uneasy whenever doctors mentioned progress? Why did nobody celebrate the improvements written into the medical reports? Most of all, why did she suddenly feel as though someone was watching her? Yet whenever she sat beside the bed and opened the secret garden, those worries seemed to fade. The room became smaller, calmer, almost separate from the rest of the world. One afternoon, sunlight streamed through the massive windows, turning the polished floor gold. Elara settled into her chair and opened the book to the next chapter. Mary thought the garden was dead, she read softly. But underneath the soil, life was still waiting. She paused and smiled faintly. That sounds familiar, does it not? Her eyes drifted toward Callum. His face remained still, peaceful, unchanged. Yet she no longer saw a stranger lying in a hospital bed. Somewhere during those weeks he had become part of her daily life. She found herself talking to him long after the book was closed. Sometimes she told him stories from her childhood. Sometimes she described people she missed. Other times she simply spoke because the silence felt less lonely when he was there. When I was 12, she said one afternoon, I wanted to become a teacher. She laughed quietly. Then I wanted to become a writer. Then a veterinarian. Then about 20 other things. She shook her head. Turns out life is not very interested in our plans. The monitor gave a steady beep. Alara leaned back. You probably had everything planned though. Billionaires usually do. A faint smile touched her lips. You had companies, investments, private jets. She glanced around the luxurious suite. Meanwhile, I considered it a successful month if my old car survived without another repair bill. For a moment she imagined what his voice might sound like. Calm, confident, maybe amused. The thought surprised her. She had never heard him speak, yet she was beginning to feel as though she knew him. Across the room the afternoon light shifted. Alara looked down at her hands. Can I tell you something embarrassing? She asked. Sometimes I think you are listening. Her voice softened. I know how ridiculous that sounds. She lowered her eyes. But every day I come here, it feels less like talking to a patient and more like talking to someone who is simply very far away. The room remained silent. Then the monitor changed. Just slightly. A tiny increase. The same response she had seen before. Alara stared at the screen. Her heartbeat quickened. There it is again, she whispered. She slowly reached toward his hand resting atop the blanket. For several seconds she hesitated. Then she gently placed her fingers against his. His skin felt warm. Real. Human. If you can hear me, she said quietly, you are doing a pretty terrible job of answering. Somewhere beyond conscious thought, beyond hospital walls and passing days, something stirred. Not a memory. Not a dream. More like a distant sound moving through darkness. A voice. Familiar now. Steady. Patient. It returned every day. It read stories. Shared secrets. Filled the silence. And somewhere deep inside a place no doctor could reach, Callum followed it. Back in the room Alara stood and moved toward the window. Evening shadows stretched across the city below. Lights flickered on one by one. She watched them quietly before speaking again. Whatever happened to you, she said softly. I hope you come back someday. Her reflection stared back from the glass. Because I think there are people who need answers. Behind her, the monitor continued its gentle rhythm. Neither of them noticed the security camera above the doorway. And neither knew that elsewhere inside the Whitmore empire, concerns were growing. Because while Alara was beginning to believe Callum could hear her, someone else was beginning to fear he might wake up. 3 days later the weather changed again. Dark clouds gathered above the city, and by late afternoon rain hammered against the hospital windows with relentless force. Alara sat alone beside Callum's bed, listening to the storm while the familiar copy of The Secret Garden rested unopened in her lap. For the first time in weeks she was not reading. Her thoughts were elsewhere. Earlier that morning her father had called. The conversation had left her exhausted. More demands. More pressure. More reminders that her marriage had never been about her happiness. By the time she arrived at the hospital, a heaviness had settled over her heart. The room felt different that evening. Quieter. Colder. Even the city lights beyond the glass seemed distant. Alara stared at the rain sliding down the windows and released a slow breath. I think I am tired, she admitted softly. Not physically. Just tired. She looked toward Callum. Do you ever feel that way? A sad smile appeared. That is a ridiculous question. You have been asleep for 14 months. The monitor answered with its steady rhythm. Beep, beep, beep. She lowered her eyes. Everyone keeps expecting something from me. My father. The lawyers. Your family. Her fingers tightened around the book. And honestly, I do not know what I am doing anymore. Thunder rumbled somewhere beyond the skyline. Alara looked at the man lying silently before her. When I first came here, I was counting the days until this arrangement ended. Her voice softened. Now I find myself worrying about you. The confession surprised even her. She stared at the floor for several seconds before continuing. Maybe it is because you are the only person who never asks anything from me. Tears threatened to form, but she quickly blinked them away. Or maybe I just got used to talking to you. The room remained still. The machines continued their quiet work. Outside, rain lashed against the glass. Alara slowly stood and walked toward the window. The reflection staring back looked older than the woman who had entered this marriage weeks ago. I do not know if you can hear me, she whispered. But if you can, I hope you come back soon. She turned toward him again. Because I am starting to think you are the only honest person in this entire family. A weak laugh escaped her. And that sounds completely insane. Silence answered. Minutes passed. The storm intensified. Eventually Alara returned to the bedside chair and gently placed her hand over his. Maybe I should stop coming, she said quietly. Not forever. Just for a little while. The words felt wrong the moment she spoke them. I think I need to remember who I was before all of this. Her eyes glistened. Goodbye, Callum. She squeezed his hand gently. Then she began to stand. Suddenly the heart monitor changed. One sharp tone interrupted the familiar rhythm. Alara froze. She looked toward the screen. The numbers were climbing. Not dramatically, but steadily. Confused, she turned back toward the bed. At first nothing seemed different. Then she saw it. A faint movement beneath his eyelids. Her breath caught. Callum. Another movement. Small. Unmistakable. Alara stepped closer. The monitor accelerated. Her heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear the rain. Callum, she repeated. Slowly, almost painfully, his eyelids began to lift. Blue eyes appeared for the first time in 14 months. Unfocused at first. Blinking against the light. Searching. Alara stared in complete disbelief. Oh my God. Her voice trembled. Oh my God. The eyes shifted, wandering across the room before finally settling on her face. For one suspended moment, neither of them moved. Neither spoke. Then Callum Whitmore looked directly at the woman whose voice had guided him through the darkness and whispered a single word. Alara. The next several hours passed in a blur. Doctors rushed into the suite. Specialists reviewed monitors. Nurses moved quickly between machines and medical charts. Yet through all the activity, one detail remained unchanged. Whenever Alara stepped away from the bed, Callum became visibly unsettled. Whenever she returned, his focus followed her immediately. By sunrise, the news had already spread through Whitmore Memorial Hospital. The billionaire who had spent 14 months in a coma was awake. 3 days later, Callum sat partially upright against a stack of pillows, physically weak but improving faster than anyone expected. His memory, however, remained complicated. Some details were perfectly clear. Others were missing entirely. He remembered building Whitmore Biotech. He remembered his mother. He remembered pieces of his childhood. But entire sections of the months leading to his accident seemed buried behind a thick fog. Do you remember me? Vivian asked during one of her visits. Callum studied her face politely. I know who you are. Something in his tone sounded distant, controlled. Vivian forced a smile. That is good. Yet the moment she attempted to continue the conversation, Callum's attention drifted toward the doorway where Alara had just entered carrying coffee and a book. His expression changed instantly. The tension in his shoulders eased. The confusion faded. There you are, he said quietly. Alara stopped in surprise. Every person in the room noticed the difference. Vivian noticed it most of all. Later that afternoon, after the visitors left, Callum watched Alara settle into the chair beside him. I know your voice, he said suddenly. Alara looked up from the book. You do. He nodded slowly. I heard it before I woke up. His eyes narrowed slightly as he searched for the memory. Not clearly. More like a light very far away. Alara remained silent. You read stories. Another pause. You talked about your life. He looked directly at her. And every time I heard you, it felt easier to keep moving toward the sound. Heat rushed to Alara's face. She glanced down at the worn cover of The Secret Garden. The doctors say that is impossible. A faint smile appeared on Callum's lips. The doctors were not there. For the first time since waking, he actually laughed. The sound was quiet and rough from disuse but real. Alara found herself smiling back. Across the following week, his recovery continued. Physical therapists worked with him daily. Doctors praised his progress. Investors demanded updates. News outlets speculated endlessly. Yet despite all the attention surrounding him, Callum trusted very few people. He listened carefully whenever executives visited. He answered questions cautiously. And more than once, Ilara noticed him studying certain family members with quiet suspicion. One evening after a therapy session, he stared out the window overlooking downtown. "Something feels wrong," he said. Ilara looked up from her chair. "What do you mean?" He remained silent for several seconds. "Everyone keeps telling me how lucky I am." His reflection stared back from the glass. "But every time I try to remember the weeks before the accident, I feel like I am standing in front of a locked door." He turned toward her. "And for some reason, certain people seem very uncomfortable whenever I start asking questions." Ilara immediately thought of the conversation she had overheard between Vivian and Owen. She hesitated. "You noticed that too?" Callum's eyes sharpened. "So I am not imagining it." Neither spoke for a moment. Outside, evening lights illuminated the city below. Finally Callum looked at her again. "Ilara." "Yes." His voice softened. "Until I figure out what happened, there is only one person I know I can trust." Ilara felt her heart skip. "Who?" Callum did not hesitate. "You." Over the next 2 weeks, Callum's strength returned steadily. He no longer needed assistance to walk short distances through the rehabilitation wing, and every new memory that surfaced seemed to sharpen his instincts. Yet the closer he came to recovering his past, the more unsettled he became. One evening he sat beside the window of his hospital suite, while the city glowed beneath a blanket of early autumn clouds. A tablet rested on his lap, displaying old corporate reports. Ilara noticed the frustration in his expression immediately. "Another dead end?" she asked. Callum exhaled slowly. "Every report from the 6 months before my accident has been edited, summarized, or filtered." He looked up at her. "It is as if someone wanted certain details removed." Ilara took a seat across from him. "Do you think it is related to Owen?" Callum was silent for a moment. "I do not know." His eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "But I know this. Before the accident, I was preparing a major internal audit." "An audit?" "A full review of executive decisions, acquisitions, and financial transfers." He leaned back. "I remember scheduling it. I remember arguing with someone about it." A flicker of memory crossed his face. Then everything goes dark. The following afternoon, Callum requested access to archived company files. The request was denied within an hour. The explanation sounded professional. Confidentiality concerns, ongoing restructuring, administrative delays. Yet the refusal only strengthened his suspicions. That evening, Ilara arrived carrying coffee and found him studying a stack of printed documents delivered anonymously to his suite. "What are those?" she asked. Callum looked up. "Something interesting." He handed her a page. At first glance it appeared ordinary. Corporate expense records, transfer authorizations, executive approvals. Then Ilara noticed the signatures. "These are Owen's." "Yes." Callum nodded. "And look at the dates." Her eyes widened. Several large transactions had occurred during the exact period leading up to the accident. Millions of dollars had been redirected into shell subsidiaries that no longer existed. "Is that legal?" she asked quietly. "That depends on whether shareholders approved it." He tapped another page. They did not. Silence settled between them. Ilara continued reading. The deeper she looked, the stranger the pattern became. Entire divisions had been sold below market value. Assets had quietly changed ownership. Key executives loyal to Callum had resigned unexpectedly. "This is not random," she whispered. No, Callum's voice hardened. "It is not." 2 days later, another memory surfaced. It happened during a therapy session. A simple question from a neurologist triggered an image. A conference room. A financial presentation. Owen standing across the table. Raised voices. Concern. Urgency. Then one sentence. Clear as crystal. "If this audit moves forward, everything falls apart." Callum sat upright so suddenly that the therapist nearly dropped her clipboard. The memory vanished as quickly as it appeared, but the words remained. That night he shared the memory with Alara. Neither spoke for several seconds. Finally she told him about the conversation she had overheard weeks earlier outside his hospital room. About Vivian's concern. About Owen's fear that he might wake up. Callum listened carefully. When she finished, his expression had changed completely. The uncertainty was gone. They knew, he said quietly. At the very least, they knew something. Alara's pulse quickened. What happens now? Callum looked toward the city lights beyond the glass. Now we stop guessing. The next morning he contacted a trusted former board member named Richard Hale, a man who had worked alongside him for over a decade. Richard arrived that evening carrying additional records retrieved from secure archives. What he revealed confirmed their worst suspicions. Financial irregularities had exploded after Callum's accident. Executive authority had concentrated almost entirely in Owen's hands. Several investigations had quietly disappeared before reaching regulators. Richard placed the final document on the table. I did not know who to trust, he admitted. But now that you are back, you deserve the truth. Callum stared at the page. At the bottom sat a series of approvals connected to transactions worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Every signature belonged to Owen Whitmore. Slowly, Callum closed the folder. His face remained calm, but Alara recognized the determination in his eyes. The pieces were finally coming together. Someone had benefited enormously from his disappearance. Someone had built an empire during the 14 months. He could not defend himself. And for the first time since opening his eyes, Callum believed he knew exactly where to look. The following month changed everything. With Richard Hale's help, evidence continued to surface. Independent auditors reviewed years of corporate records. Regulators reopened previously ignored inquiries. Board members who had remained silent during Callum's absence suddenly began asking difficult questions. Owen's influence weakened with every new discovery. Vivian withdrew from public appearances almost entirely. Yet despite the growing storm surrounding Whitmore Biotech, the moment that affected Alara most happened far from conference rooms and financial reports. It happened on a quiet afternoon inside the hospital garden. Callum had finally progressed enough to spend time outdoors. The autumn air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves across the landscaped pathways. Alara sat beside him on a wooden bench beneath a maple tree painted gold and red by the season. For several minutes neither spoke. They simply watched people pass through the garden. Patients, families, nurses. Ordinary moments that felt surprisingly precious. You saved my life, Callum said suddenly. Alara looked at him. The doctors did that. He shook his head. The doctors kept my body alive. His blue eyes settled on hers. You gave me a reason to come back. Heat rose to her cheeks. She looked away toward the trees. You are giving me too much credit. No, his voice was calm. Certain. I am not. Silence returned. Comfortable this time. Then Callum reached into the pocket of his jacket and removed a small envelope. What is that? Alara asked. He handed it to her. Confused, she opened it and discovered several legal documents. Her heart immediately sank. Callum, he nodded slowly. The marriage annulment paperwork. Alara stared at him. The words felt heavier than they should have. I do not understand. Ido. His gaze never left hers. When this began, you did not choose any of it. He looked toward the garden. Your father made a decision. Lawyers made a decision. Everyone else decided what your life should become. His expression softened. You deserve the chance to decide for yourself. Alara looked down at the documents. Weeks ago she would welcome them. Now she felt strangely empty. You are setting me free, she whispered. I am giving you a choice. His voice carried no bitterness. No expectation. If you want to leave, you can leave. If you want a different life, I will help you build it. He smiled faintly. No contracts. No obligations. No debt. Alara swallowed hard. Why would you do that? Callum laughed softly. Because somewhere between waking up and learning the truth, I realized something. He paused. The only genuine thing that happened during the worst period of my life was you. For a moment she could not speak. Every memory flooded back. The first night beside his hospital bed. The stories she read. The conversations no one else heard. The day he opened his eyes. She realized those moments had changed her too. Yet fear still lingered. What if I am only here because of everything we went through? She asked quietly. What if this is not real? Callum considered the question carefully. Then take all the time you need. He nodded toward the papers. Sign them if that is what you want. The wind stirred the leaves overhead. Elara looked down at the documents one final time. Then she slowly folded the envelope closed. Not signed. Not accepted. Just held gently in her hands. Callum noticed and smiled. Neither of them spoke again as the autumn sunlight filtered through the trees. But for the first time since their impossible marriage began, the future belonged entirely to them. 1 year later, spring sunlight poured through the glass ceiling of a newly completed conservatory on the Whitmore estate. Thousands of flowers filled the space with color. White roses climbed elegant trellises. Fresh greenery stretched beneath arched pathways. At the center stood a garden unlike any other in the city. Elara paused near the entrance and stared in amazement. What is this? She whispered. A smile touched her lips as she stepped forward. Every detail felt strangely familiar. Hidden benches rested beneath flowering vines. Stone pathways curved through beds of colorful blossoms. Small plaques displayed passages from a certain novel she knew by heart. The Secret Garden. Her favorite chapters appeared throughout the conservatory. Her fingers brushed one of the engraved passages and her eyes widened. Callum. She turned slowly. He stood several feet away, looking healthier than ever. The past year had transformed him. His strength had returned. His company had recovered. Independent investigations had confirmed serious misconduct within the executive leadership during his absence, leading to major changes throughout the organization. Accountability had finally arrived. The uncertainty that once surrounded his future had disappeared. Yet the expression on his face now had nothing to do with business. I wanted you to see it before anyone else, he said softly. Elara looked around again. You built this. Not exactly. He smiled. We built it. She frowned slightly. What do you mean? Callum walked toward her. Every chapter you read. Every conversation you thought I could not hear. Every moment you sat beside my bed when nobody else believed I was listening. His eyes never left hers. This place exists because of those moments. Emotion tightened her throat. For a second she could not speak. The conservatory suddenly felt very quiet. I almost stopped coming that night, she said. I know. His smile softened. I heard that too. Tears immediately filled her eyes. You really remember? Not every word. He laughed quietly. But I remember enough. He stepped closer. I remember a woman who thought she was talking to someone lost in darkness. His voice lowered. What she never realized was that her voice became the path home. Elara looked away, overwhelmed. 1 year earlier she had arrived at a hospital carrying a burden she never chose. She had expected obligation, sacrifice, survival. Instead she had discovered purpose, healing, and something far more valuable than either of them expected. There is something else, Callum said. Her attention returned to him. Slowly he reached into his pocket and removed a small velvet box. The sight instantly stole her breath. Callum. He shook his head gently. The first ring was attached to a contract. His voice remained calm. It represented a decision made by everyone except us. He opened the box. Inside rested a beautiful diamond ring that sparkled beneath the sunlight filtering through the glass ceiling. This one is different. Elara's vision blurred with tears. Callum lowered himself onto one knee among the flowers she loved. You once told me that real life is not a fairy tale. He smiled. You were right. A few tears escaped despite her efforts to stop them. Because fairy tales usually end when people find each other. He took a slow breath. Our story only began there. The entire garden seemed to hold its breath. Elara Bennett, he said softly, will you choose me this time? For a moment she simply stared at him. Then she laughed through her tears and nodded. Yes. The answer came instantly. Completely. Yes, I will. Callum slipped the ring onto her finger. As she wrapped her arms around him, Sunlight poured through the glass above, illuminating the garden that had started as a story read beside a hospital bed. Months later, friends and loved ones gathered in that same conservatory for a small wedding celebration.
No contracts. No obligations. No hidden agendas.
Only two people choosing each other freely. As the evening drew to a close, Elara found herself standing beside Callum beneath the flowers that had become part of their journey. He squeezed her hand gently. "You know," he said, "the doctors spent months trying to explain how I woke up." Elara smiled. "And did they figure it out?" Callum looked at her with the same expression he had worn since the day he opened his eyes. "No," he lifted her hand to his lips. "But I did." If this story touched your heart, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to Chosen by Love. Every subscription helps us bring you more unforgettable billionaire romances, emotional journeys, and inspiring love stories that prove kindness can change a life. Let us know in the comments what moment moved you the most, and join our growing community of dreamers who believe that true love is always worth the wait.